Well, it is good to be with you today. I welcome you to Heart of Life. For those of you who are gathered here, elsewhere, thank you for taking the time that we could be together today. I hope that you've had a great week. I hope that you have. I had a good week, and one of the highlights was to get to celebrate my dad's 80th birthday. Isn't that cool? I am proud of my dad. I am. And I am grateful for his influence on my life. And to get to celebrate 80 years of that, that's pretty cool stuff for me. Pretty cool stuff. Today, we are starting a new teaching series, and I think the best way to set this up for you is to tell a story. When actually it's going to be several stories that I'm going to weave together in the beginning to get to the point, all right? So early in the New Testament, the answer to the question, what is required for salvation, is answered clearly. It is by grace, through faith in Jesus alone. It is not by grace through faith in Jesus plus my goodness, my efforts, my baptism, whatever. No, it is by grace through faith in Jesus, not Jesus plus my works, not Jesus plus anything. It's Jesus. But that truth was a struggle for, I think, many of the Jews in that early New Testament time because they had grown up with, for example, the dietary laws. They had grown up with the observing the feast and the festivals and the holy days and the sacrifices. And I'm saying all of that good because it was part of what God had given them, pointing them to their need for a Savior. But now that Savior had come, making Jews and Gentiles, and by the way, if you're new to this whole thing, the word Gentile just means anybody that's not a Jew. So because of Jesus, now the Jews and the Gentiles, he is making one family by grace through faith in him. So you need to know that when I read to you the little part of the story that we're about to start with from Galatians chapter 2. Galatians chapter 2, in verse 11, the Apostle Paul gives us this insight. Here's what he says. When Cephas came to Antioch. Now, anybody know Cephas' other name? Yeah, we know him best as Peter, the Apostle Peter, all right? So when Cephas came to Antioch, I opposed him to his face. Does that sound like Paul? Yeah. He's like, I opposed him to his face because he stood condemned. For before certain men came from James, he used to eat with the Gentiles, talking about Paul. But when they arrived, he began to draw back and separate himself from the Gentiles because he was afraid of those who belonged to the circumcision group. So here's the story. The Apostle Peter is enjoying the freedom that Jesus has brought, where now he can actually sit down with Gentiles who don't observe the same dietary laws that Paul has been taught his entire life. But we know that God was crystal clear to Paul. Acts chapter 10, God even, like a vision, God's like, Paul, this is okay. He sends him to Cornelius and his whole household. Remember that? But here in Galatians, Paul or Peter is doing that. But then a group arrives from the kind of the home church in Jerusalem, and apparently this is a group that kind of struggles with this whole freedom thing, and we should be sitting down with people who aren't exactly like we've always been, and they influenced Peter. And in turn, because Peter has influence, this is what it says in verse 13. The other Jews joined him, that's Peter, in his hypocrisy, so that by their hypocrisy, even Barnabas was led astray. And I'm telling you that when I'm reading this story, this is the phrase that caught my attention the most. Even Barnabas was led astray. Now, we are introduced to Barnabas early on in the Acts story. In Acts chapter 4, verse 36, for example, we are told Joseph, a Levite from Cyprus, whom the apostles called Barnabas, which means son of encouragement. Son of encouragement. Now, you hear people get called sons of stuff a lot, right? It happens every once in a while, but son of encouragement, man, that's good. And what we know from Barnabas is that is exactly who he was. In Acts chapter 4, man, he is incredibly generous. He is selling a piece of property to give those resources to help people who are in need. But as we continue to read his story, we realize that his heart is even bigger. For example, when Jesus causes that collision with who we now know as the Apostle Paul on the road to Damascus, it was the day, right, that Paul's life was changed and he was transformed from being someone who persecuted the Jesus followers to becoming a Jesus follower. But then we learn in Acts chapter 9, here's what follows. When he, that's Paul, who's now changed, when he came to Jerusalem, he tried to join the disciples, but they were all afraid of him. Why were they afraid of him? Because he's the one who's been putting Jesus followers in prison. They're afraid of him, not believing that he really was a disciple. Verse 27. But who? Barnabas. Barnabas took him. Barnabas took him and brought him to the apostles. He told them how Saul on his journey had seen the Lord and that the Lord had spoken to him and how in Damascus he had preached fearlessly in the name of Jesus. Barnabas alone of all those disciples in Jerusalem was willing to set aside Paul's history of persecution and give him a chance to prove that he really was a changed man. And in doing that, God used Barnabas to set up what we now know for the church, the greatest missionary, the greatest theologian that we have ever known, the Apostle Paul. Barnabas took him. Later in Acts chapter 12, as the story continues, Barnabas and Paul bring with them a young man by the name of John Mark. They bring them with him to Antioch from Jerusalem. Now, Mark's mom's name was Mary. She had a house in Jerusalem. It's actually the house where the disciples were praying on that day when Peter was miraculously, escaped prison, if you will. And so Mark grew up in Jerusalem after, Jesus' death and his resurrection. He knows all that's happened around all of that. Well, in Acts chapter 13, Paul and Barnabas, called by the Holy Spirit, are ready to leave Antioch and be missionaries, and they decide to take John Mark along. Let's bring him along and let him learn. But something happened in the journey, and it's wild because when you read the story, Luke only mentions it in one sentence, and Luke simply says, John left them and returned to Jerusalem. That's all he says. Well, 2 or 3 years later, after that missionary journey is done, Paul says it's time to take a second missionary journey to go back through those places where churches were started. We want to build them up and strengthen them. And when he says that, here's what we know occurs in Acts chapter 15, verse 36. Sometime later, Paul said to Barnabas, "Let us go back and visit the believers in all the towns where we preach the word of the Lord and see how they are doing." Barnabas wanted to take John, that's John Mark, also called Mark, with him. But Paul did not think it wise to take him because he had deserted them in Pamphylia and had not continued with them in the work. They had such a sharp disagreement that they parted company. Barnabas took Mark. Who did he take before? Paul. This time he takes Mark and sailed for Cyprus, but Paul chose Silas and left, commended by the believers to the grace of the Lord. He went through Syria and Cilicia, strengthening the churches. When nobody else wanted to, Barnabas takes Paul. And when Paul doesn't want to, Barnabas took Mark. And what we see in this man is a guy who believes in second chances, right? I mean, Barnabas represents a guy who he is patient with other people's failures. He's the guy you want in your corner. A guy that's generous, a guy with strength. But now if we circle back to the story that we started with in Galatians chapter 2, that Barnabas was led astray. And it's a reminder that we need to be reminded of every once in a while. Come on, even strong leaders can go astray. Just because somebody has walked faithful for a period of time, right, doesn't mean that they can't go astray. And in Barnabas' case, I want you to see, he's a son of encouragement, right? Well, check this out. Sons of encouragement are vulnerable to minimizing the importance of truth for the sake of relationships. That's what we see happen with Barnabas in that story in Galatians. Because what was at stake? It's the truth of the gospel. That's what's at stake. What does it take to be right with God, right? And Paul knows that when the truth goes, the gospel goes, and when the gospel goes, souls die. And so for people like Barnabas, sons of encouragement who have a strength, right? A strength and an inclination to stand up for people, it can also lead to a weakness. And I think that's what happens in Galatians chapter 2. Now, my question is, how come the Apostle Paul didn't fall into that same trap? Like, how come somebody like Paul doesn't fall into the same hypocrisy that Barnabas did? And I think maybe it's because Paul did not feel the same emotional empathy of those Jews who had come from Jerusalem like Barnabas did. Paul's focus was so mission-centered, right, that the emotions and the opinions of other people just did not have the same importance on him that they had on Barnabas. In fact, one chapter earlier in the book of Galatians, Galatians chapter 1, verse 8, Paul makes this statement: "But even if we or an angel from heaven should preach a gospel other than the one we preach to you, let them be under God's curse." Paul's like, this is Paul. Paul's like, I don't even care if it's an angel, right? It's like, and then he goes on to say in verse 10, this will help put it in perspective. Am I now trying to win the approval of human beings or of God? Am I trying to please people? If I were still trying to please people, I would not be a servant of Christ. If Barnabas is a son of encouragement, I call people like Paul sons of thunder. Just sons of thunder. And here's what I want you to see. Sometimes sons of thunder are vulnerable to minimizing the importance of relationships for the sake of the mission. Now, don't misunderstand what I'm saying. The mission is absolutely important. Jesus calls us to the mission. But my point is, the Apostle Paul, as strong as he was, has a tendency to say, I don't have time to deal with people like John Mark who fail. I don't have time to deal with people like John Mark who quit on us. There is a mission, and we are moving on with this mission without John Mark. I just want you to see that in both of those guys who are incredibly strong, there is also the shadow of a weakness. And so Paul, Barnabas, Peter, and all of us, this is where we start in this series. We all have influence, and we all have a shadow. We all have influence, and we all have a shadow. I want us to set the understanding that you have influence. I don't care who you are, what your role is, you got influence. You have influence with your family, whether you are a grandparent, a parent, a sibling, right? Brothers, sisters, aunts, uncles. We all have influence, but we also have a shadow. You have influence with your work. You have influence with your school, coworkers, friends, teammates. You have influence, but you also have a shadow. You have influence on social media. Oh my, do some of you have an influence, right? You have influence on social media, but you also have a shadow. And that is what we're going to talk about in this series that we have chosen to title Overcoming the Dark Side of Influence. Overcoming the dark side of influence. And here's the main thought. We all have influence, but we also all have a shadow. And if we don't learn to recognize the shadow of our influence, if we don't learn to recognize the dark side of our influence, we will continually, in a negative way, affect ourselves and even the people that we love. Now, what's tricky about this is that most people, when they are operating in life, they don't think about their shadow. And when it comes to influence, I don't think we do either. So almost think about it with, we're always, if I had my phone with me and I turn on the flashlight, I'm moving toward the next achievement. I'm moving toward the next responsibility that I want to fulfill. I'm moving toward the next accomplishment. I am on a mission. I am moving forward. But as I am moving toward this light, what it is casting is a shadow. But most of us don't walk looking at the shadow. We hardly ever pay attention to the shadow. And this series is to say, but we need to. We need to. Because where did the shadow come from? Where do those dark sides of influence come from? And for a few minutes today, I want to set it up so that in the weeks that follow, we can get really specific as we look at those truths. So where did it come from? Well, certainly we're not going to negate the fact that our pride and our selfishness and our self-deceit, all that plays a part. But our pride and our selfishness and all that is also very much connected to how we handle the painful experiences of life. They're connected. Some of you, perhaps at some time in your life, some of you decided maybe to go an education route in that you decided to pursue a degree. And it is likely that whatever that degree may be, there are certain classes, let's say, that you are required to take, even if it's not your major, even if it's not your degree. And maybe for some of you, you can relate to this. You look at the required list, and on that list is Psychology 101. Psych 101. And depending on what your degree was, you're like, why do I have to take Psych 101, right? Because those classes always amaze me. They give you just enough information that you walk out of there thinking you're dangerous, right? You walk out of 101 thinking you are a psychologist, right? But they give you the info. If you took that class, it is most likely that one of the things you were introduced to was a pyramid called Maslow's pyramid, or a hierarchy of basic needs. Now, I'm just going to use that to help us understand a little bit of sometimes how the dark side, how the shadows form. Because what Maslow's pyramid represents is this thinking that each of these layers are basic needs or wants in our life, and in order for you to have the next level of needs met, you got to have the prior. So you start at the bottom, all right? Those needs met, then the next needs can be met, then the next needs can be met. So, for example, physiological needs are the very basis, right? It's like you got to eat, you got to drink water, right? You got to be able to sleep, you got your health. So if those needs aren't met, then on a very foundational level, it looks like hunger and thirst and fatigue and illness, all right? But if those are met, then we move to the idea of everybody has a need for safety, a need for security. But if something happens and those needs aren't met, then all of a sudden there is this insecurity in your life, a sense of loss or fear or obsession or compulsion. But if those needs can be met, then you move to the third, which is belonging or social connection. I'm going to attach another word that used to be love. It's love. It's the need to be loved. But if that isn't perceived, then all of a sudden there's this feeling of being unwanted and worthless and empty and lonely and incomplete. You get the picture. And then it moves to value, esteem, and then it moves to self-actualization. So here's my point. If pride and selfishness and self-deceit and wrong motives, all that stuff plays a part in the shadow that I have, it is also true that family, relationships, what happens in developmental years, all of that provides a catalyst for this mixture to determine what my shadow ends up looking like. I'll give you an example here in a minute, but just going to talk through it for a second. How we're able to handle the experiences of life determine the degree to which we are controlled by our shadow. So let me put the process in another way, because some of us can see it better, I think, in another way. Needs, traumatic experiences, existential debt, and dark side development. Here's what we mean. The needs that I'm talking about are the ones that you just saw on that pyramid, all right? And what happens when those needs are threatened, all right? Some traumatic experience occurs. It can be a traumatic experience that occurs to you. It could even be a traumatic experience that you see occur to someone else connected to you. It could be a family member. It could be a neighbor. And because of what happened to them, all of a sudden there is a fear that you begin to experience because what you see take place in them. Well, what often happens out of that is what's called existential debt, which means that you begin to feel that unmet need is because of your own personal failure, even if it's not. And there's an emotional debt that we start to try to pay throughout some unhealthy behaviors throughout our adulthood. And if you put all that together, needs that aren't met, traumatic experiences that occur, existential debt, you put all that together and it develops what we're calling in this series your shadow or dark side. So let me give you an example. See if we can put this together. There is a need for security. a need for safety. So a child knows when they feel safe or they don't. But all of a sudden, in that child's life, that need for safety is disrupted by a divorce. Just heartbreaking divorce. And all of a sudden, the safety of a home, the safety of parents, all of a sudden, that is broken. And here is often what happens in the heart of a child. Man, I wonder if I had just minded my mom and dad a little better. I wonder if more regularly I would have cleaned my room like my mom told me to. Would she still be here? Now, come on, we've seen the scenarios before, and what you immediately want to say to that child, it's not your fault. You didn't do it. But that's not the point in this moment, because that's what that child feels. That is their perception. And what often happens is if they don't deal with that, their entire adult life is spent in a subconscious effort to repay the debt that they believe that they have. Even though it wasn't their fault, even though going forward they can't put the thing back together, they live with this forward view that the more significant their achievements in life can be, then it is more likely that the debt they need to pay can be repaid. Now, anybody recognize that kind of stuff? That can motivate people to do amazing things. That can motivate people to great accomplishment. That can motivate people to high levels of leadership. But the point is, what is lurking in the background is that it is being driven by a motive of guilt that comes from an enemy. It is being driven by guilt, causing a price of weariness to your soul that eventually will crush you because you never fulfill it. So, kind of summary, right? Our dark side is inclined to be overcompensation for the needs that have not been met in our lives, and it develops as we attempt to repay the existential debts of varying degrees that we've taken on. Let me give you maybe a visual. Anybody ever play Jenga? Any Jenga, Jenga? Y'all know what I'm talking about, Jenga? All right. It's kind of an old school game, but it's pretty fun. You've got 54, I think it is, typically wooden blocks. And you stack the blocks to where it builds a tower. And then you take turns removing the blocks from within the tower. Don't knock down the tower. That's the goal. Don't let the tower fall, but you remove a block from the tower, and then what do you do with the block? You put it on top. You put the block on top. I'm saying that is a picture of what we're talking about here when things like experiences of abandonment, loss, when approval is withheld, like from a parent to a child, maybe abuse, maybe dealing with an alcoholic parent or an alcoholic spouse. Maybe it's a humiliating event that takes place in your life. Maybe it's being left out of something that meant the world to you, or being turned down by someone who meant the world to you. And all those experiences can become like blocks that are pulled out from under that pyramid of basic needs where you need safety and you need love, and all of a sudden there are blocks that are being pulled out from under. And they get moved to the top in the way that all of a sudden those gaps, those hurts, those voids then become the driving force for what your life becomes, because you're always striving to get it. Can you see that? For a lot of people, the shadow or the dark side has provided the fuel for achievement in life. It's kind of like this silent trainer that you have who just tirelessly coaches you to keep striving and keep working and keep achieving in order to win. But when the lessons of the dark side are never learned, it drives even people who are very successful to make unwise, impulsive, unethical, immoral choices that eventually leads to failure that hurts not only themselves, but also often the people that they love the most. Well, there has got to be a better way than that. And the good news, there is. And that's why there's a series called Overcoming the Dark Side of Influence. And today, I am simply starting by, shining the light on this thing to say if we're going to overcome the dark side of influence, it's going to require our attention. It's going to require our attention. We have to be willing to go, I have a shadow. It's going to require a pause, a stop, and that's what this series represents, that for a number of weeks, and we're going to get specific. We're going to get specific in the weeks that follow of some real, I think, powerful examples of what drives many of us, and to ask the question, what's really behind that? But today we start with the fact that we have to pay attention, and that includes others' attention. All right? I don't want us to move past the truth that in the story that we read earlier between Paul and Barnabas, does anybody recognize those two dudes needed each other to walk it out faithfully? They needed each other. Paul needed Barnabas. He needed him in the very beginning just to build trust with the people that it was going to be really difficult to build trust. But even later on, he needed Barnabas to step in for John Mark, because later in Paul's life, we hear Paul say these words, "Hey, bring John Mark." Eventually, Paul was blessed by John Mark again. And Barnabas was a part of helping to make that happen. Barnabas needed Paul. He needed Paul to help him stay grounded in the truth when Barnabas suddenly was about to slide in a direction that was not the right way to go. God used them together. And he also added Peter and John Mark and Luke and Silas and Timothy. We all need the light of one another's strengths to illuminate the shadows that we have. So today I'm going to give you just 3 numbers to maybe encourage you to start to think about how this looks in your life and how you move toward that. I want you to think about 3 numbers, the number 3, the number 12, and the number 120. I'm picking those numbers because I think those are significant numbers when I look at how Jesus functioned, how he did ministry. Jesus had 3. The 3 were Peter, James, and John. All right? And we know that there are occasions that those 3 tended to be with him when nobody else was with him. There was a connection there with those 3. Jesus also had the 12. We refer to them as the 12 disciples. Right? And then the 120 number represents the number of people in the room at Pentecost. The number of people who had gathered in that room when God sent his Spirit and his church was born. Influence doesn't happen alone. And I'm convinced that this is a reminder. It happens in circles like 3 and 12 and 120. The 3 represents that core inner circle in your life of people you trust your everything with. And if you've got them, you know who I'm talking about. And for most people, it's not a big crowd. It might, if there's 3, like you feel blessed. And I'm not saying that it has to be confined to 3, but I'm saying it's more than 1 in that you. There's somebody else, or maybe you got 2 or 3 or 4, but it is a very small core of people that you know them well. And so you don't always agree on everything, but the thing doesn't crash because you know their heart. You know where they're coming from. You know why they think the way that they do. You love and trust their heart. 3. The 12 then represents a circle, though, of strong relationships, even beyond the 3. And I do think the number 12 is a significant number. If any of you have ever had to lead teams of people or you've ever been in any kind of setting, even something like a Bible study, it's interesting how 12 is kind of it's close to a maximum number where you can simultaneously attend to what each person is subtly thinking or feeling, right? You can tell in a group of 12 if somebody's kind of out of sorts. You can tell if somebody's a little restless or they're a little quiet. You can tell if somebody's not on board with what you're trying to get the team to be on board with. You get much bigger than 12 and you lose the ability to keep track of all that. In fact, sometimes it's hard to keep track of who's there and who's not. And by the way, we have learned in recent years that platforms like Zoom are not a good medium for building the kind of in-depth trust that you're really after. Now, don't get me wrong. I'm saying there are moments you got to use it, and there are moments that it can be okay. But you cannot pay attention to 12 little triangles on your screen like you can when you can look into the eyes of 12 people sitting around a table with you, right? You can't. You can't read those triangles on a screen the same way. You just can't. And I'm not downplaying Zoom. Don't go tell everybody I hate Zoom. I kind of hate Zoom, but don't go tell everybody. But I'm saying sometimes it can be useful. Sometimes you can quickly get something done, but if your goal is trust, then a screen struggles to deliver. It struggles to deliver. So you got 3 and you got 12. And then the 120, that was the big group that was gathered in that room at Pentecost again. And I mean, 120 sounds big compared to 3, but what a small number if you're going to change the world, right? If you're God and you're going to change the world, how many do you start with? You're like, I don't know, God, like, give me 10,000, 100,000. I don't know. Or actually, you know what? If we're going to affect millions, we probably need to start with 1 million. Nah, 120. 120. So 3 that you can fully trust your life with. 12 that you can have face-to-face strong relationships with. And 120 where you can have real buy-in for the mission that God has called us to together. It looks like a few tight friendships, a life team, and a regular gathering on mission. Wow. And all together, we help each other shine light on the shadows. What appears to me is that I look back over the last couple of years and all that we have had to deal with, it has led people to a tendency to let their circle shrink and shrink and shrink. Jesus did it with 3 and 12 and 120, but somehow we think we can do it with less. I think the temptation is to let our circles shrink until all I have left is just one person to trust: myself. And it won't work. We're learning that it won't work. So come on, as Jesus followers, if Paul and Barnabas and Peter needed each other, you need some people. You do. You need some people. Overcoming the dark side of influence requires attention. It means that other people are a part of God's design and helping in that, but it also means our attention. So, I know this guy. He was out of town and his car wouldn't start. Now, that's just like one of those frustrating things that happens, right? And it's bad enough when you're in a familiar territory, but he's not in familiar territory. It was also a major holiday weekend, and no automotive shops are open. But to his benefit, where he was and where he was broken down, there just happened to be a big car show going on literally in that proximity, right? So you got hot rods and all kind of cool stuff going on there, but what that also meant was car people, right? Because there's car people and then there's not car people, right? There's car people. And so he's struggling, and because they're in the proximity, all of a sudden some of those car people began to offer their help. But nobody could get the car to start. And so thankfully, he had AAA, right? He calls AAA, and despite it being a holiday, the guy shows up. So the guy shows up, starts to test the battery. It's not that. Checking all the lines. Everything looks clear, looks right. He's checking fluid level. I mean, everything looks good. It's like, what's the deal? And then all of a sudden, the AAA guy says, "You didn't happen to leave it in drive, did you?" Yup. He did. He just simply left the vehicle in drive, and therefore he couldn't start it. Sure enough, that was the problem. Here's why I'm telling you that story, because I want you to consider. Some of us today may be wondering, even though we really, really, really want to live a life, right, of influence. We want to impact our families and work and school and friendships. I mean, we want to live a life of influence, but some of us maybe are wondering why our life just isn't working the way it's supposed to. And could it be that maybe, just maybe, it's because we have left our shadow in drive? Up until now, just haven't even really considered how that part, that side, could actually influence our own life and drive us forward. So in this series, we're going to call AAA. But this is what AAA looks like in this series. Admit, aware, and apply. Here's what it means. Each week, when we unpack, right, an example of, hey, here is what drives some of us, here for many of us, this is what our life tends to look like as we go forward. It's willing to admit, if that's me. It's willing to acknowledge, right, if that's me. We're going to look at biblical examples. We're going to try to give us some questions to be able to ask ourselves, and this means that we're willing to ask them and admit if it's us. Aware means that I'm willing to step into understanding what's causing this in my life. It means that I'm willing to step into understanding the impact that this thing is having on me and the people that I love. It is being willing to realize how and when this tends to show up. And then apply. Apply means that I am seeking the healing that God wants to bring. By applying the truths of a God who says, I know you got physiological needs. Have you heard my promise? I'll feed you and I'll clothe you. I will take care of you, right? Until the day comes that your days are done, until it's time to go to be with Him, His promise is that I will meet those foundational needs in your life. But will we apply those truths? To battle an enemy who wants us to believe that there are gaps in our life that cannot be filled. We're willing to apply the truth of a God who says, in me, you are secure. When I'm your God, nobody else can own you. When I'm your God, you are at rest in me, despite what an enemy tells you that there are experiences that you've gone through that you do not feel secure. We're willing to apply the truth of a God who says, I love you. I love you. And from this point on, yes, I want you to listen to me and I want you to obey me. I want you to follow, but right, there's not a single thing that you can do to get me, your God, to love you more than I love you right now, because I love you to the fullest. And listen to me, if you think Barnabas is good at giving people second chances, you should talk to the Jesus that I know. We're going to apply the truth of a God who says, I give you purpose for your life. You are valuable to me, and I will use you to influence the lives of your children and your brothers and your sisters and your families and your teams and your coworkers and friendships and neighbors. I am the God who will use you to influence. But let's take care of that shadow, because the shadow is not supposed to drive you. I, Jesus, am supposed to drive you. That's where we're going. Aren't you fired up? I am. I truly am. Because I believe with all of my heart that there are so many people that never stop long enough to think about what we're going to think about and to ask God to bring healing to our lives. So, can we just pray for a second? Can I invite you just to bow your heads where you are? I'm just going to let this be personal, just you and God, and just spend a few minutes being with Him. But I'm asking you this question, right? Are you willing to take an honest look at both the positive and the negative sides of how you influence others? Are you willing? And if you are, then right now, just as we're kicking this thing off, and in the weeks that follow, right, it'll get specific, but just to begin, to ask God to help you to be willing, to ask God to help you to be open to letting Him show you. Just spend a few minutes. and ask him to do that. And then I'm going to pray for you. God, I am so grateful for the opportunity that you are giving us. I'm thankful already for the weeks that follow. God, the examples that you give us from your word, the principles that you show us from those stories that we can read. God, it enables us to have an opportunity to truly be honest in allowing you to show us who we are. God, I'm asking you to give us a willingness to be honest with our own heart. I'm asking you to give us a willingness to perhaps to see some relationships built with other people in your family who can help us do the same. God, for some of us, we need to be intentional about a few people that we build those relationships with. For some of us, we need to be intentional about being in a gathering that is moving forward in your mission. God, will you help us to be intentional? God, I know there's a whole bunch of people that hurt. For most of us, the potential for multiple blocks to be missing. God, times over our lives that we have experienced traumatic experiences, times that we have experienced disappointments that just, God, it feels like they leave a void. Will you give us faith to believe that you fill the emptiness? Will you give us faith to believe that you heal? And God, in the middle of a culture that feels like it has an ever-growing distrust for people of influence, God, I'm asking, would you make your church a genuine influence? God, a people after your own heart. God, instead of us being a people who complain about living in a country where there's a lack of trust, God, we're going to ask you to make us trustful people. So God, would you heal? Would you heal? And would it be your motives and your love behind what drives our lives? I love you, Jesus, and I thank you for what you're going to do. And it's in your great name